Richard sat alone in his sprawling marble-floored mansion, surrounded by everything money could buy, but not a single soul he could truly call his own. The chandeliers above shimmered with cold, artificial beauty, and the silence of the house was deafening. Every room was dressed in designer furniture, every corner a museum of wealth, but Richard felt like a ghost drifting through it all. He had built an empire from the ground up, outworked his competitors, invested smart, and achieved what others only dreamed of. But tonight, as he stared out the massive bay window overlooking the lit-up skyline, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't sure if anyone in his family loved him anymore, or if they ever had. Grace, his wife of over 2 decades, had once been full of warmth and laughter. Or at least, he had believed so. But over the years, her attention had shifted, from Richard to retail, from affection to assets. She wore luxury like armor, each designer label stitched with distance. She rarely smiled at him anymore unless it was in front of others, unless there was a camera, or unless he brought home something new and extravagant. The woman he fell in love with had slowly turned into someone he barely recognized, someone polished, composed, and hollow. Their daughter Sophia wasn't much different. At 23, she had never worked a real job, never taken the subway, never known a single day without luxury. Her world revolved around social media, shopping sprees, and endless brunches with friends who only cared about how many followers she had. Richard tried to talk to her, tried to ask her about her dreams, her passions, her inner world, but all he got were eye rolls and requests for new shoes. He'd always told himself he was doing it all for them. That the late nights and business deals were to give his family everything he never had. But now he realized they didn't want him. They wanted what came with him. And that hurt more than any failure he had ever faced in business. The idea came to him late one night, lying awake in the darkness of his master's suite while Grace snored softly beside him, her diamond earrings still on. What if he took it all away, not for good, but just long enough to see the truth? What if they thought he had lost everything? Would they stay? Would they comfort him? Or would they leave the second the spotlight faded? By morning, the plan had taken root deep inside him. Richard called his most trusted attorney and arranged to move his liquid assets into a private offshore account, completely inaccessible to anyone else. He sold off stocks in silence, pulled favors, and created a legally airtight illusion of total financial collapse. No one suspected a thing. His mansion, his cars, his companies, all remained in place for now, but legally, Richard was ruined. When the time came, he gathered Grace and Sophia in the grand sitting room, the same place they had celebrated birthdays and hosted politicians. They came down irritated, Grace with a glass of imported wine, Sophia glued to her phone. He stood there, heart pounding, and told them, a business deal had gone horribly wrong. Everything was gone. They were in debt. They would have to move immediately, maybe even leave the city. For a few moments, there was stunned silence. Then, the storm came. What do you mean gone? Grace snapped, eyes wild. You're Richard Langston. You don't just lose everything. Sophia stared at him, dumbfounded. Wait, are we poor now? You mean no more black cards? No more Cartier? I mean, Richard said quietly, we have nothing. I'm sorry. There were no tears. No hugs. No reassurances. Grace launched into accusations. How could he be so reckless? Why didn't he tell her sooner? Was this some kind of midlife breakdown? Sophia simply stormed upstairs, slamming the door behind her and screaming into her phone about her life being over. Richard sat down on the edge of the leather sofa, feeling cold all over. He had just confirmed his deepest fear. 3 days later, they left the mansion. Grace refused to pack a single bag, leaving the help to handle it. Sophia cried over having to leave behind her walk-in closet. They drove in silence to a small cottage in the countryside, one Richard had quietly bought months ago under a different name. It had a broken fence, no internet, and one bathroom. The silence on the drive was louder than a train crash. The first night, they slept on creaky beds in a single room. Grace wouldn't stop muttering about the smell, the dust, the lack of air conditioning. Sophia curled up in fetal position and cried herself to sleep. Richard stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he heard crickets instead of traffic. And somehow, despite everything, he felt something close to peace. He woke up early the next morning to roosters and a sunrise he hadn't seen in decades. He stepped outside, breathing in air that didn't smell like exhaust and cologne. A man approached him from the path near the trees, a neighbor, Daniel, a former soldier turned farmer, with rough hands and kind eyes. "New here?" Daniel asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Yeah," Richard said. "Trying something different." Daniel grinned. "You look like you've never held a shovel in your life." "I haven't," Richard admitted. "Well," Daniel said, "you're in luck. I've got an old one you can borrow." That's how it started, Richard digging trenches, learning to plant tomatoes, chopping wood like he was in some kind of old movie montage. Daniel helped without asking for anything, taught him without mocking. Richard came home each day with dirt on his clothes and sweat on his back, and he felt alive. Grace refused to go outside. She spent her days trying to find cell service, waiting for a signal that never came. Sophia wandered aimlessly, bored out of her mind, until she started sneaking off into town. Richard noticed. He wasn't stupid. But he waited. This wasn't just a test for them. It was becoming a test for himself, too. Could he live without wealth? Could he find meaning without the empire? One morning, he overheard Grace talking softly to someone on the phone. "You don't understand, Morgan. He's a good man, but he's ruined. I can't live like this." Morgan. That name stuck with Richard. The village chief. Rumored to be wealthy. He said nothing, but his stomach turned. He didn't confront her, not yet. He just went outside and chopped more wood. It was only the beginning. Richard's hands were beginning to harden. The soft skin that once typed emails and signed million-dollar deals now bore calluses and soil-stained creases. He no longer woke to the glow of city lights or the ping of back-to-back meetings, but to the sound of wind rustling through trees and the distant bray of livestock. The simplicity of it grounded him, yet the cracks within his family deepened like a spreading fire under a wooden floor. Grace had grown colder. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was hostile. She blamed Richard daily, sometimes with passive jabs, other times with sharp words that cut deeper than she realized. "I married a provider, not a farmer," she snapped one evening, throwing a dented tin pot onto the counter. "You've made us into some charity case for your ego." Richard said nothing. He had said all he needed to when he stripped away the comfort, the marble floors, and the private drivers. Every complaint from Grace now was confirmation that his fears had been well placed. Sophia had stopped pretending altogether. She resented everything, the food, the clothes, the silence, the neighbors. She barely spoke to her father, choosing instead to disappear for hours during the day. Richard asked once where she'd been. "Out," she said flatly. "At least someone in this village knows how to treat me." There was bitterness in her voice, not the kind born of hardship, but entitlement, unhealed and unchallenged. Richard began to hear whispers in the village, about Sophia, about a man named Mr. Brown. A married man. At first, he refused to believe it. Sophia might be spoiled, might be selfish, but surely she knew better. Then he saw them. One afternoon, while returning from Daniel's plot of land, he saw her getting into Brown's red truck. Brown was a good 20 years older, and very much not single. The embrace was far too intimate to be innocent. Richard froze. That moment was not anger, it was heartbreak. That night, he didn't confront her. Instead, he sat on the porch with Daniel, passing a bottle of cheap whiskey between them as fireflies blinked in the distance. "You okay?" Daniel asked. Richard hesitated. "If you take away money, status, property, what's left of a man?" Daniel lit a cigarette and looked out into the dark. "Just his truth." Silence passed between them like a tide. Then Daniel added, and the people who stay with him when he's nothing. Richard couldn't sleep that night. The weight of silence from his wife, the betrayal of his daughter, the ache of being unknown in his own home, it all pressed down on him. He stepped outside in the early hours, walked to the edge of the field, and screamed. Not in rage. In grief. The next morning, Richard found Grace standing at the gate in a dress too clean for farm life, her makeup impeccable. She was speaking softly to someone, Chief Morgan. The man wore gold rings and sunglasses that didn't match the countryside. His hand brushed Grace's arm. Her laugh was low, flirtatious. Richard turned around and walked away before they saw him. His heart was a steel drum being struck too hard. By the end of that week, he confronted Daniel privately. "I know what Grace is doing," he said, his voice even but tired. "And I know about Sophia." Daniel looked pained. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you. But yeah. Everyone's talking." Richard nodded. "Then it's time." He walked into the house and called a family meeting. Grace looked irritated. Sophia looked like she'd been interrupted. Richard stood in front of them not as a broken man, but as one who had seen through every illusion. "I know what's going on," he said. "I know both of you are chasing things you think will bring you back to comfort. But you've lost more than money here. You've lost your values. Your decency. And your dignity." Sophia scoffed. "You dragged us into this nightmare. What did you expect? That we'd become peasants and thank you for it?" "I expected honesty," Richard said. "I expected you to stand by me if you ever truly loved me, not the house, not the money, me." Grace folded her arms. "We built a life, Richard. A real one. You don't get to burn it down and judge us for wanting it back." "You didn't build anything," Richard replied, his voice steady. "You lived in a palace I built with love. And now, you spit on the foundation because the paint faded." He turned to Sophia. "And you, what are you looking for in a man who lies to his wife to be with you? You're better than that. Or at least, I thought you were." Sophia flinched, but said nothing. Richard reached into his coat and pulled out 2 envelopes. "This is what you wanted, right?" He handed one to each of them. "Money. Not much. Just enough to go wherever you need to go. You're free to leave." Grace looked at the envelope like it was poison. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this test is over," Richard said. "And you both failed." He left them standing there in stunned silence and walked out the door. Daniel was waiting by the gate. "Where to?" Daniel asked. "Back to work," Richard said. "I still believe in rebuilding." From that day on, Richard lived alone with Daniel on the farm. They rebuilt the fence, grew crops together, and slowly turned the land into something that felt like home. There were no chandeliers. No servants. No brand names. Just honest work and quiet evenings filled with real conversations and shared meals. Word got out about Richard's story. Some people called him cruel. Others called him brilliant. But he didn't care. He had discovered what most men never dared to face, the truth about the people closest to him. And for the first time in years, Richard felt free. The weeks that followed were quieter than anything Richard had known in decades. The chaos had subsided, leaving only the steady rhythm of rural life, the creak of the front porch in the morning, the thud of boots in soft earth, the call of birds at dusk. With each passing day, the pain in his chest loosened, replaced by something sturdier, not joy, not yet, but peace. The kind of peace that only comes after the breaking. Grace and Sophia left 3 days after the confrontation. There was no teary goodbye, no angry last words. Just the hum of a car engine, the crackle of gravel under tires, and the silence that followed. Richard watched from behind the curtain, his face blank. Daniel stood at his side, offering no words, only presence. Sometimes that was enough. At first, he thought he'd feel liberated, but instead, what came was emptiness, a cavern echoing with the years he had poured into people who could walk away so easily. Yet, slowly, the land filled the silence. The earth gave back. The farm began to flourish, crops sprouting where dry soil once ruled, the greenhouse humming with grain. There was sweat, sore backs, and aching hands, but every task carried weight, and with weight came meaning. Richard and Daniel became something like brothers. Evenings were spent by the fire pit, telling stories, laughing quietly, or sometimes sitting in shared silence. They weren't trying to impress anyone anymore. No need to perform. No need to prove. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. It was from Grace. The handwriting was still the same, elegant, sharp, intentional. Inside, a single sheet of paper trembled in Richard's hand. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't beg to come back. What she wrote was simple. I didn't know how empty I was until you made me look at myself without the glass of luxury between us. I hated you because I couldn't hate myself. But I do now. And I'm trying to change. Not to win you back. Just to finally meet the woman I should have been. Richard read it once. Then twice. And he folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, not because he believed everything she wrote, but because he wanted to believe someone could wake up late and still be saved. 2 weeks later, another letter came. This time from Sophia. Hers was messier. Less crafted, more raw. Dad. I miss you. I was angry. I was scared. I didn't know how to live without attention, without people telling me who I was. I made a mess of everything. Mr. Brown's wife confronted me, and I saw myself in her face, and I hated what I saw. I've started working at a bakery in the city. It's not glamorous. But I'm learning what it feels like to be tired for a reason. I don't expect you to trust me again. But I wanted you to know. I'm trying. This time, Richard didn't fold the letter. He left it open on the kitchen table for days, rereading it when the ache returned. He had asked the universe for truth. And this was truth in its most painful and human form. One chilly morning, Richard stood in the field and looked out at the hills. Daniel joined him, wiping his hands with an old cloth. Thinking about them again, he asked. Richard nodded. They failed the test I gave them. But maybe it was never about them passing. Maybe it was about them facing it. Sometimes people need to fall hard to remember who they are, Daniel said. Sometimes love has to break before it can rebuild. That same afternoon, Richard wrote 2 letters of his own. Not promises. Not invitations. Just reflections. He told Grace he respected her effort. That healing was a process, not a performance. That he wished her peace. And he told Sophia that mistakes didn't define her, that it was what she did next that mattered. He ended with, I'm proud of you for standing up. Even if it was late. He mailed the letters with no expectation. He'd already lost them once. This wasn't about winning them back, it was about telling the truth when it finally felt like he had nothing left to hide. Weeks turned to months. The farm flourished. Then, one rainy morning, a knock came at the door. It was Sophia. No makeup. No designer bag. Just a raincoat, a backpack, and eyes that carried the weight of something real. She looked older, sharper, but softer too. She stood on the porch, drenched and shaking. I didn't come to stay, she said. I came to help. Richard nodded and stepped aside. She entered the house without wiping her feet, without hesitating. Something had shifted. She worked alongside him and Daniel that week. Quietly. No complaints. No drama. She struggled with the tools, fell in the mud, cried once when her hands blistered, but never asked to quit. Richard didn't praise her. Not yet. He knew growth was fragile. But at night, when she sat by the fire with them, smiling faintly as Daniel teased her, he felt something in his chest crack open. One day, she turned to Richard as they repaired the old greenhouse windows and asked, Do you think Mom will ever come back? Richard looked up at the clouds. She might. But I don't think that's the question. Sophia nodded. Then what is? Will we be ready if she does? He said. That night, Grace called. Her voice was softer than he remembered. Not broken, just real. She had been volunteering at a women's shelter. Helping with resumes, donations, anything she could do. I used to think giving meant paying, she said. But giving is what costs you pride, time, sweat. And I'm still learning how. Richard didn't cry. But something in him softened. They didn't talk about getting back together. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time in years, they talked like two people who once loved deeply, and maybe still did, beneath the dust. By the end of the year, Sophia had saved enough money to start her own online craft store, handmade jewelry inspired by the countryside. She named it Humble Origins. The logo was drawn by Daniel's nephew. Richard bought the first piece. The old mansion in the city was still under Richard's name. But he never moved back. Instead, he sold it. The money went to fund a new project, the True Wealth Foundation, a nonprofit helping families in crisis, focusing on teaching financial literacy, self-sufficiency, and rebuilding broken homes. He put Grace on the board. Sophia gave workshops to young women trying to reclaim their self-worth. And Richard? He stayed on the farm. Planted new seeds. Raised chickens. Fixed fences. Watched the sunrise and thanked the soil beneath his boots. He had tested his family and lost them, but in losing them, they all found themselves. And somehow, in that twisted, painful, beautiful way that life works, they found their way back to each other. Not through wealth, but through truth. The spring that followed was unlike any Richard had experienced before. Not because the flowers bloomed brighter or the rain fell more softly, but because, for the first time in decades, his life was rooted in something real. Not earnings. Not power. Not image. Just purpose. The True Wealth Foundation took off faster than Richard expected. Not because of flashy campaigns or billionaire connections, but because the story behind it was raw, human, and undeniably relatable. People weren't drawn to Richard Langston the tycoon. They were drawn to the man who risked everything, not to gain more, but to find love that couldn't be bought. The story of a man who faked losing the world to find out what in it was real. Grace, now based in the city, took her board role seriously. She no longer wore heels that clicked through marble corridors or silk scarves tied with flawless precision. Her clothes were simpler now. Clean. Practical. Her schedule was filled with meetings with struggling single mothers, ex-housewives rebuilding their lives after divorce, and young women lost in the chase for material validation. She didn't preach. She listened. She offered advice not as a woman above them, but as one who had once been lost too. At night, she sometimes wrote long letters to Richard. They didn't talk often by phone. It was better this way. More honest. Less reactive. The letters weren't just about updates, she wrote about things she never said aloud, how ashamed she had felt when she caught her own reflection in the village mirror and didn't recognize the person looking back, how much she missed the way Richard used to hold her wrist when he was trying to make a point gently, how her heart still hurt when she remembered that moment in the sitting room, when he handed her an envelope that felt heavier than gold. Richard kept every letter in a wooden box in his room. He never replied with words. But when he visited the city for board meetings, he always brought her something small, fresh honey from the farm, a hand-carved wooden pin, a scarf he found at the countryside fair. Nothing extravagant. Nothing loud. Just pieces of the life he now understood. Gifts wrapped in quiet understanding. Sophia's business grew slowly, but with integrity. She refused to take shortcuts. Every piece she sold had her fingerprint, her design, her effort. Sometimes customers would ask, "Wait, are you the Sophia Langston?" She would laugh awkwardly and nod. But she didn't flaunt the past. She used it. One afternoon, while packaging orders, she got a call from Richard. "I was thinking," he said. "Maybe next season, you and I can build a little workshop behind the barn." For your jewelry. You could come back out here. Not forever. Just, try again. There was silence on the other end. Then a soft, trembling yes. She arrived that summer with 2 suitcases and a crate of tools. They built the workshop together, sawdust in their hair, hammers echoing against wood, laughter bouncing between them. It wasn't just about the structure. It was about rebuilding trust, moment by moment, nail by nail. In the evenings, they'd sit by the porch with Daniel, whose health had begun to wane. He never complained, but Richard noticed his hands shook more, and he coughed at night. One evening, under the stars, Daniel looked at Richard and smiled. You know, he said, voice gravelly, when I met you, you were rich in everything except truth. Richard chuckled. And now? Now you're broke, Daniel joked, but damn rich in soul. When Daniel passed in his sleep that fall, the whole village came out for his memorial. He didn't have family. But Richard, Sophia, and even Grace stood beside his casket, hands interlocked, mourning the man who had taught them how to live without pretending. They buried him near the hill where the sunrise hit first. Richard paid for the gravestone, but Sophia chose the inscription, a quiet man with roots deeper than gold. The first frost came early that year. Richard stood outside one morning, watching the breath leave his lungs in soft clouds, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. Sophia came out beside him, wrapped in a scarf Grace had sent. You ever think about going back? She asked quietly. Richard looked at her, then out at the empty fields. Back to what? He asked. To the mansion. The city. The old life. He paused, then smiled softly. No. That life was rented. This one? I own this one. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I think I want to own mine too. They stood like that for a while, just father and daughter. 2 souls once divided by illusion, now stitched together by hard-earned truth. That winter, they held the first annual True Wealth Retreat on the farm. Families from all over the country, some wealthy, some poor, some broken, came to spend a week working the land, unplugging from the noise, and reconnecting. They slept in simple cabins. Ate together. Talked. Dug their hands into soil, not for harvest, but for healing. And Richard, standing in front of a bonfire on the final night, looked out over the crowd and said only this. I once had everything and still felt like nothing. But then I lost everything, and found something that no wealth can buy, the truth about who I am, who I love, and what matters. If you leave here with nothing else, leave with this: real wealth is never in what you keep. It's in what you're willing to give when everything else is gone. The crowd stood in silence, then applause. As the fire crackled behind him, Sophia stepped forward and took his hand. And Richard, once a man obsessed with legacy, finally understood. This was it. This was the legacy. The second retreat was even bigger than the first. Word had spread, not because of marketing, but because people had left changed. Some called it a spiritual reset. Others described it as a week without masks. It wasn't about lectures or life coaches. It was about chores and sunrises, broken fences and shared meals, planting seeds not just in the ground but in each other. And at the heart of it all was Richard, quiet, steady, no longer a man needing to be the center, but someone who had finally found peace on the edges. The farm had grown, not in acres, but in life. The barn had been rebuilt into a multi-use space, part storage, part teaching center, part gathering hall. Children painted murals on the inside walls, images of trees with roots, of families holding hands, of open skies. One wall was dedicated to Daniel, painted with a likeness that caught his tired eyes and kind smile so perfectly it made Richard tear up every time he passed it. Sophia's workshop now had 4 employees, all women from difficult pasts. She taught them not just how to make jewelry, but how to build a business with values. She refused to outsource. Every item came with a handwritten note. One simply said, "You are more than your mistakes." Grace came back that spring, not to stay, but to visit. She arrived in a modest car, no designer luggage, No personal assistant. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with silver. Her eyes were clearer. She brought baked goods and books, and a stack of handwritten letters from women her work had helped. She and Richard walked the fields together for the first time in years. They didn't speak of the past like a wound, but like an old road they both had limped through. She didn't ask to come back, and he didn't ask her to. But as they sat under the apple tree Daniel once planted, Grace turned to him and said, "We made mistakes, Richard. But maybe we needed to break in order to open." He nodded slowly. "I think we were always trying to build something real. We just started with the wrong materials." She stayed for a week. Cooked with Sophia. Planted flowers. She held her daughter longer than she had in years, apologizing with her hands more than her words. And when she left, she kissed Richard on the cheek, not with desperation, but with gratitude. The kind of kiss you give someone who helped you find your way back to yourself. That summer, the foundation expanded to 3 more farms in different states. Each run by people like Richard, those who had fallen hard and gotten up slower but stronger. Each retreat welcomed families of all kinds, estranged fathers and sons, exhausted single mothers, teenagers caught in cycles of anger and silence. The land healed them. Or rather, it gave them the space to begin healing themselves. Richard began writing, not memoirs, not manifestos, just reflections. Pages about mornings when fog blanketed the fields, about how the weight of a shovel could ground you better than any therapy session, about how failure wasn't the end of love, but often its beginning. One afternoon, sitting in the barn-turn classroom, he read a short essay aloud to a group of visiting teens. "I used to think being rich meant having everything. Now I know being rich means having someone who shows up when you have nothing." There was silence. Then one boy, probably 15, raised his hand. "Do you miss being rich? Like, the mansion, the cars?" Richard smiled gently. "Sometimes. But only the parts that weren't real." The boy frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I miss the dream more than the reality," Richard said. "But I wouldn't trade what I have now for 10 lifetimes of what I had before. Because now, people call me by my name, not my net worth." That night, Sophia sang around the campfire. She'd picked up guitar from one of the volunteers, and her voice, once shrill with entitlement, had grown raw, warm, textured. She sang about starting over. About remembering your name. About letting go of what sparkles so you can find what shines. And as Richard watched her, surrounded by people smiling, leaning on each other, wiping tears, he realized something so simple, it nearly stopped his heart. This wasn't just the end of his journey. It was the beginning of theirs. He had set out to test his family, to expose what was false. But in the end, he had helped build something truer than he ever imagined. The final chapter wasn't about the farm. It wasn't about the money, or the letters, or even the forgiveness. It was about choice. Richard had chosen to break his own illusion. Grace had chosen to face herself. Sophia had chosen to walk through shame instead of around it. And all around them, others were choosing too. Choosing to be real. To show up even after they'd been broken. To believe, somehow, that love could survive honesty. And that maybe, just maybe, that was the richest kind of life anyone could ever live. The 3rd anniversary of the True Wealth Foundation brought with it a quiet kind of celebration. There were no red carpets, no cameras, no speeches polished by PR teams. Instead, there were lanterns, hundreds of them, lit by the hands of those who had once been broken, once forgotten, once hollowed out by the illusion of worth, now glowing with a light that came from within. The lanterns floated skyward like soft prayers, each carrying a message scribbled on paper: "Forgive me. I'm still healing. I see you. I'm trying. I'm enough." Richard stood in the middle of the field where it all began, hands deep in his pockets, watching them rise. Sophia stood beside him, her hands wrapped around a lantern of her own. It read, "Thank you for not giving up on me." He didn't need to ask who it was for. He already knew. Life had taken a shape Richard hadn't expected but had grown to love. Grace came to visit more often now, always as a guest, never as someone assuming she belonged. Yet with every visit, every shared garden chore, every hour spent kneading dough beside Sophia, something softened. They no longer spoke of divorce papers or past betrayals. The silence between them no longer held bitterness, it held history. And strangely, tenderness. There was one day in late autumn when Richard found Grace sitting in Daniel's old chair, eyes misty, a letter in her lap. "I thought I hated you," she whispered. "But it turns out, I hated how much I forgot myself." Richard didn't speak. He just knelt beside her and held her hand. There were no promises exchanged. No questions asked. Just the quiet pulse of forgiveness being given without being demanded. Sophia's business had become nationally known by then, but she still made every order from her workshop on the farm. She had offers, partnerships, investors, but she turned them down. "I built this from something that nearly destroyed me," she told a reporter once. "I'd rather keep it small and honest than let it get big and hollow." When asked about her father, she only smiled and said, "He gave me the gift of truth. That's worth more than anything we lost." One morning, a boy arrived at the farm. He couldn't have been older than 16. His clothes were worn, his eyes guarded. His name was Jeremy. He didn't speak much at first. He barely looked anyone in the eye. But Richard saw something in him, something he remembered in himself long ago. A deep ache to be seen. They let Jeremy stay for a weekend. The weekend turned into a month. One day, while fixing the fence line, Jeremy finally asked, "Is it true that you used to be rich?" Richard smiled faintly. "I thought I was. And now? Now I'm something better." Jeremy squinted. "What's better than rich?" "Free," Richard said. By Christmas, Jeremy called the farm home. That winter, Sophia found Richard in the greenhouse, bent over rows of seedlings. "We should write a book," she said. He looked up, brow raised. "Not about you," she teased. "About the truth. About what we learned here. What people carry when they think they're alone." He thought about it for a long moment, then nodded. "Only if we write it together." The book came out in the spring. The Richest Man I Know, by Richard and Sophia Langston. It wasn't a bestseller, not in the traditional sense. But it found its way into quiet libraries, into rehab centers, into youth homes and battered women's shelters. Letters came in, handwritten, raw, trembling with relief. "You told my story before I knew how to speak it. I thought I was the only one who broke my family and had to learn how to love them again. I read it aloud to my son. We cried together. Then we planted a tree." One letter came with no name. Just one sentence. "You saved us." Richard kept that one folded in his wallet. Years passed. The farm remained, steady as the sunrise. It expanded a little, but never too much. Richard made sure it stayed quiet enough to listen, to the wind, to the laughter of new guests, to the stories whispered on porches in the dark. One evening, he sat by the fire pit, older now, slower, hands still calloused but gentler. Grace sat beside him, her gray hair tied back, eyes calm. Sophia was inside, reading to a new group of young women. Jeremy was teaching a teen boy how to fix a tractor out back. Grace leaned over and whispered, "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't tested us?" He looked at the stars. "Sometimes. But then I look around, and I think, maybe life had to strip us down before it could dress us right." She smiled. "I think you're still poetic. Even after all this." He chuckled softly. "I think I finally mean it." As the fire crackled, a cool breeze sweeping through the trees, Grace reached into her coat pocket and handed him something. It was a note, creased, aged. He opened it slowly. It was the same one he'd given her years ago. The envelope that started everything. She had written across the back in small, delicate script. "I didn't pass the test. But I studied. And I'm still learning." He looked at her, his throat tightening. Me too, he said. They didn't need to say more. The lanterns would rise again the next year. More hands would come. More truths would be spoken. More people would arrive hollow and leave whole. And Richard Langston, the man who once had everything and nearly lost himself, would still be there, not to save anyone, but to remind them that it's never too late to begin again. And that the richest lives are the ones lived with nothing to prove and everything to give. The day the first snow fell on the 5th year of the foundation, Richard awoke before the sun. He didn't know why. He hadn't set an alarm, hadn't been restless, but something pulled him to the window. Outside, the earth was covered in a fresh white blanket. The trees bowed gently under its weight, and the sky glowed soft gray. He stood there for a long time, one hand gripping the curtain, the other resting on his chest as if checking his own heartbeat. Downstairs, the kitchen was already alive. Sophia had taken to rising early these days, baking bread before the others stirred. She greeted him with a flour-dusted grin and handed him a steaming mug of tea. "You always wake up on the first snow," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Like clockwork." He smiled. "Maybe it's the land's way of saying, we made it through another year." Sophia leaned down the counter. "We should host a gathering this winter. A quiet one. No speeches. Just people who've been here. Like a reunion." Richard nodded. "A night of stories." The word stories lingered in the air. It was, after all, how it all began. One man's search for truth. One family's unraveling. One lie that revealed everything real. Plans were made. Letters sent. No formal invitations, no RSVP cards, just handwritten notes that said, "If the farm helped you remember who you are, come home." And they came. From across the country. Former guests. Broken fathers now mended. Daughters who had stopped hiding. Women who once arrived with fear in their eyes now stood tall, smiling. Jeremy, now 22, returned with his own non-profit team. He had launched a traveling service project called Fix Forward, helping repair homes in low-income areas. He always said the idea was born the day Richard handed him a toolbox and said, "You don't have to fix everything, just start with one thing that matters." Even Grace came, not as a guest this time, not as a visiting name on the board, but as someone who knew the layout of the farmhouse by heart. She helped prepare soup in the kitchen, hugged people like they were long-lost siblings, and when she sat beside Richard by the fire that night, there was no tension between them. Only presence. The barn was warm, the floor scattered with woven rugs and mismatched chairs. The lights were strung low, flickering like stars pulled down from the sky. People took turns standing, telling stories, not of success, but of becoming. They spoke of shame melted by kindness, of forgiveness that took years to offer, of the slow and steady work of facing yourself. Sophia stood at one point and spoke softly. "My father didn't try to teach us a lesson with money. He was just trying to find out if there was anything underneath it. And when it all fell apart, we had to start again, not from scratch, but from the truth." She turned toward Richard. "Thank you for not needing us to be perfect in order to love us again." He didn't speak, but his eyes shimmered with quiet water. Later that night, as the guests started retiring to cabins, Richard stepped out into the snow. It was still falling, thick, silent, forgiving. Footprints stretched in every direction across the farmyard. Lives crossing, colliding, continuing. He walked to the edge of the field, where Daniel's stone stood. It had been years, but the grief still lived in the soil. Richard knelt beside it, brushing snow from the name. "We kept it going, brother," he whispered. "We kept it honest." Behind him, he heard steps. Grace. She stood quietly, then knelt beside him. "I still remember the day you handed me that envelope," she said, smiling softly. "It was the worst day of my life." "It was the best day of mine," Richard said. She looked at him. "Do you think we needed to lose everything to find ourselves?" He nodded. "I think we needed to find out who we were without anyone clapping for us." She placed her gloved hand over his. "Well, I like who we became." They sat there for a while, the wind humming, the snow falling gently around them, as if the world were tucking them in. The next morning, Richard awoke with a slow stretch. He was older now, his movements stiff, but his breath came full and steady. He stepped outside, watching the sunrise paint the snow in orange and gold. Sophia stood in the yard, scarf wrapped tight, a steaming mug in her hand. "You look like you're about to give a speech," she said. "I was thinking about something," he replied. She grinned. "Of course you were." He looked out across the farm, the rebuilt barn, the cabins dotting the woods, the fields sleeping beneath the frost. "I used to think legacy was what you left behind," he said. "But it's really who you walk beside, and who keeps walking long after you stop." Sophia stepped closer and wrapped her arm through his. "Then you've built a beautiful one." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That afternoon, as the last guests left and the farm returned to its peaceful rhythm, Richard sat at the window in his favorite chair, watching the light fade. The sun dipped below the horizon. The fire crackled softly. And Richard Langston, the man who had once tested love with loss, sat in the quiet of a life fully lived, not in marble halls or power rooms, but in the warm echo of redemption, in the joy of those who came home, and in the stillness of knowing that truth, no matter how painful, is the soil from which all love finally grows. Winter turned to spring again. The fields thawed, the trees budded, and the wind carried the scent of fresh soil and new beginnings. Life on the farm moved gently, like a hymn whispered between generations. The retreat season had paused for a few months, allowing the land, and the people who cared for it, to rest. Richard was slower now. His steps were deliberate, his hands not as quick with tools as they once were. But there was a light in his eyes that never dimmed, a quiet brightness that came from knowing he had spent his final years building something that mattered. Sophia had taken over most of the daily operations. Her laugh had grown deeper, her posture straighter. She walked the land like someone who belonged to it, not out of ownership, but because she had earned her place in its rhythm. She often sat by the porch swing at dusk, barefoot, scribbling ideas in a leather notebook, new programs for the foundation, notes for a second book, names of people she wanted to invite back. Grace was a part of the farm now, too, not every day, but more than anyone expected. She had sold her city apartment and moved to a small cottage on the other side of the orchard. Some nights, she brought soup to the main house. Other days, she helped repair clothes or mentored young women passing through the retreat. She didn't ask to rekindle anything with Richard, and yet something quiet and faithful bloomed again between them. It wasn't romance, exactly. It was softer. Something like respect reborn after being burned down. They often walked together after dinner, not to revisit the past, but to witness the present. They spoke about books, about memory, about how people change, and how sometimes, they don't. One morning, Richard didn't come down for breakfast. Sophia knocked once. Then again. When he didn't answer, she opened the door gently. He was sitting in his favorite chair by the window, a blanket over his lap, his glasses resting on the open pages of a book. There was no panic. No cry. Just a stillness so full and complete, it felt like the world had taken one long exhale. Sophia didn't move right away. She sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. The fire in the hearth still crackled. Outside, the early sun painted the room gold. Grace arrived minutes later. She stood in the doorway, tears quietly slipping down her cheeks. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The days that followed were quiet. People came, not in black suits or limousines, but in worn boots and tear-stained smiles. They brought casseroles in memory. They sat in circles around the barn and told stories, some funny, some broken, all beautiful. Jeremy flew in from Michigan, now running 6 regional teams. He brought a photo of the first fence he and Richard built together. "He didn't just teach me how to fix things," he said to the gathered crowd. "He showed me how to stand still long enough to be known." They buried Richard on the hill beside Daniel, beneath the oak tree they had planted together years ago. The headstone was simple, as he had requested. Richard Langston. He lost everything to find what matters. He gave us the truth, and stayed to see us grow. Sophia inherited the farm. Not as a duty. As a calling. She didn't change much. She still rose with the sun. Still spoke to the land like it remembered her voice. On the anniversary of her father's passing, she walked to the hill with a new letter. She tucked it under a stone. Dear Dad. You never stopped planting things, even when they broke. Even when they died. Even when they didn't bloom for years. Now, everywhere I look, there's something you planted. And I promise you this, I'll keep planting too. Love. Sophia. And so the farm continued. New faces arrived. New wounds came to be soothed. The old cabin walls echoed with new laughter, new grief, new beginnings. And somewhere in the wind, if you stood very still and listened carefully, you could still hear his voice. Real wealth isn't what you hold. It's what you're willing to give away, and who you become when there's nothing left but truth. And that, perhaps, was the richest ending of all.